All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled A Responsive Feeding Approach to Supporting Piggy Eaters and Their Families. My name is Kevin Sanchez, and I'm NYU McSilver's Program Coordinator for TTAC. A few logistics about today's webinar before our presenters begin. As we've done in the past, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides to the TTAC website. Additionally, you'll be receiving an email notifying you that these resources are available. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar, and we ask that you chat in your questions using the chat box functionality, selecting all panelists on the dropdown. We will set time aside at the end of the webinar to address these questions. For those LMSWs, LCSWs, and LMHCs interested in obtaining CEUs, you will be eligible to receive 1.5 CEU for attending this webinar. If you're only joined by the phone, we would need for you to join the webinar via your computer in order to obtain credits for the CEUs. Further information and instructions will be distributed via email following the webinar. Finally, towards the end of the webinar, we will be sending out our feedback survey using the chat box functionality. We ask that you click the link that is shared in the chat box and complete the feedback survey. We appreciate you filling this out as it allows us to understand your experience and enhance our future TTAC offerings. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Evelyn Blank, Executive Director at the New York Center for Child Development and Director of TTAC.
Kevin, thank you so much and welcome everybody. We're really pleased to have everybody here today. And just a brief note about who we are. The New York City Early Childhood Mental Health Training and Technical Assistance Center is funded through the Mayor's Office of Community Mental Health in partnership with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. TTAC is a partnership between New York Center for Child Development and the McSilver Institute on Poverty Policy and Research. New York Center for Child Development has been a major provider of early childhood mental health services in New York, with expertise in informing policy and supporting the fields of early childhood mental health through both training and direct practice. The NYU McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research houses the Community and Managed Care Technical Assistance Centers, fondly known as CTAC, MTAC, which offer clinic, business, and transformation supports statewide to all behavioral health providers. TTAC is tasked with building capacity and competency of mental health and early childhood professionals through ongoing training and technical assistance. And on the next slide, just kind of a screenshot to our newly updated website. And this is a great resource to go to see previously offered webinars, other resources, and to really kind of stay abreast of some of the things that are going on around TTAC and throughout the city. And it is now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Gil Foley, who's the clinical co-director of TTAC, who will introduce our speaker today. So thank you, Gil.
Thank you, Evelyn. And it's a pleasure, certainly, to have Marsha here and all of you. I had the fortunate opportunity to get to know Marsha when I did some consultation around attachment issues for some OTs. And I was so favorably impressed that we really felt very motivated to have her with us, and it's a privilege. Marsha Dunn Klein is an occupational therapist who specializes in feeding in her career of over 5 decades. She's been a clinician, a business owner, an author, and an inventor of the Duro spoon and Teeter heart. She presents nationally and internationally and is the founder of 2 nonprofits, Nourish, which supports families whose children have eating challenges, and the Get Permission Institute, which provides online pediatric feeding education. And I think her most recent book, which she shared with me, is quite wonderful, Anxious Eaters, Anxious Mealtimes. And I just want to comment as a mental health professional, I think we all know that with young children, the body is really the mirror of the mind and the inner life. And often problems of a psychic nature often first show up in problems in eating, sleeping, and digestive functions. And I think we also know that eating, not only is it essential to survival, but it is really, eating and feeding are really the prototypes for learning and taking in all aspects of the environment. So it has a central role for us as mental health professionals in both its literal meaning and also its metaphorical meaning in assimilating the world. And I'll turn it over to Marsha.
Gil, thank you so much. And thank you, TTAC, for putting this all together. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm coming to you from Tucson, Arizona, and hoping to share some ideas today about a responsive look at picky eaters. I want to share my disclosures that are on this screen. I think most of those are already within the context of what Gil has described to you. And our objectives. And I'm giving you contact information for me. If we don't get through all the questions at the end of today, I'm happy to respond to your questions. So this is how you can get a hold of me. One of the things I just want to comment on is that throughout my slides, there are grasshoppers, and many times I've been referred to on the internet as that grasshopper therapist. And I'm just going to give you a moment of what that is about. I talk a lot about children who have worry when they're eating and have fear, stress, and just anxiousness about eating. And I had the opportunity in a travel to Oaxaca to try and be offered grasshoppers. And so I described the story of my children and I being offered grasshoppers as an opportunity to think about what it's like to be a worried eater for even just a moment. And so I have that on videotape at the www.getpermissioninstitute.com. You are welcome to look at it, to share it, to show it to other people. And I've also written the story out, and I have it in a lot of different languages, maybe 15 different languages. So please check it out if it's helpful for you in your work. And this is my newest book that Gil referred to, and a lot of what I talk about is in that book. So I immediately regretted giving the topic to the TTAC program about picky eating, because what I realized was you're a very diverse group and there's a lot to talk about in picky eating. And I do workshops for 16 hours on just this topic. So deciding what to share with you today took me a bit. And so I hope that I give you a big enough overview about picky eating within the context of responsive feeding. Also give you resources. When I refer to literature and make statements, I'm going to give you some articles and resources that support those topics. You don't have it now, but when this is done, you'll be sent an extensive bibliography. You'll also be sent a Mealtime Piece pie, and I'm going to not the edible kind. I will refer to that a few times. And then a slide deck from the talk. So there you go. So let's think about it for a second. Some of you have no experience with picky eating. Some have experience with your own picky toddlers or picky preschoolers. Some of you may have picky eating challenges yourself. And so what I want to do is to lay the groundwork that picky eating is actually, I would describe it as a continuum. So there's toddler picky eating, and that's pretty typical, that children, when they're going through an autonomy stage or really want to do it themselves and can be pretty adamant about being a picky eater. But for most of those children, if we support their autonomy, we support their bodily needs, their sensory needs, most of those kiddos work out of it. And there are kiddos that are more dug in their picky eating. And in England, they're called fussy or choosy. Some of these kids we describe as having sensory processing problems. Some of them food neophobic. Some have had scary emotional experiences, and then food is just worrisome to them. And then I have a book that I've called, of course, Anxious Eaters. Some are called Extreme Picky. And then many of you are beginning to meet children and adults who have diagnoses or meet the criteria for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. That would be ARFID. And in this continuum of picky, I would describe it as going from developmental sort of typical stage towards children at this end of the continuum often have genetic components. There's a genetic bias towards towards pickiness, towards depression, towards anxiety, towards worry. And so we're going to see a whole gamut of picky eaters. So this is the slide that's going to give you some resources to find more about each of these different topics. Leanne Birch described food neophobia, or really popularized it in the late 90s, and described fear of new foods. And for a while, I kind of liked that term when I was working with families, because I see a lot of the pickiest of eaters, the most worried eaters, that reacted to food fearfully. And so I like the concept of thinking about how can we support their fear and worry rather than support just more bites and more numbers and more volume. So we needed to find a different way to look at those kiddos. The diagnosis of ARFID came out more recently, and it's being adapted and tweaked a little in the next DSM. But it actually describes eaters that have a very narrow diet, and that their diet can be very specifically narrowed because of food brand and texture and sensory variables. The children or adults that eat are missing entire food groups, and that would describe themselves as worried or fearful oftentimes as I speak with adults with this diagnosis, but also would describe themselves as, this is not a choice. This is not just a pickiness fad. This is who they are. This is who they are to their core, and that this is hard for them. We also see a lot of children on the autism spectrum, and children where neurodiversity really does make a difference, that they are approaching the world from a different sensory place, from a different integration place. And so for many of all of these children, one of the factors that I see that's a thread is change. Change is hard. My diet is this, and change is going to be difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of what our picky eaters have in common, and then I'm going to share a little bit about our most picky eaters, and then I'm going to share ways we can support young eaters to not push into their worry, to support developmental needs in eating, and try to give you ideas that will sort of be helpful for most of you. What our picky eaters have in common is many times they're telling us no. They're communicating, this is not working for me. This cartoon is very clear, but what's not clear is, why is this child telling us no? Is this child telling us no because he just ate a bowl of goldfish crackers 10 minutes before? Is he telling us no because he's having cramps because he's constipated? Is he telling us no because the last time he saw this food, he choked and gagged and he's really worried about it? Is he telling us no because the relationship isn't working with this caregiver? Is he telling us no because he can't breathe and eat at the same time? We don't know any of those things until we've asked further questions and gotten to understand that child and that parent more in depth. But what we do know is he's communicating no. And in my belief, it's our job as adults to listen and try to understand, why is he telling us no? So the influences on picky, it could be that it's the developmental stage. It could be that it's their health or skill challenges, that there's connection problems with that grown-up, that the grown-up is wanting to feed them, but they want to do it themselves because they need autonomy, that the motivation might be coming from the grown-up instead of the child, and so that we have to look at how motivation matters, the presentation matters, the food matters, the sensory variables in the food matter, and pressure matters. So let's look at our most picky eaters for a few minutes to have a framework. In the most picky eaters that I see, of course, when we meet a new person with a feeding challenge and a new intake, we're going to ask the family about, what's your child's food list? What are their favorite foods, their preferred foods? I used to call those, what are their safe foods? but I don't anymore because I think safe is a weighted word, and the opposite of safe is unsafe. And I don't want to in any way innuendo that there's weight to what foods the child's eating. I just want to know neutrally, what are those foods your child really enjoys and will eat? I'm going to be really interested in those sometimes foods. Those are the foods that parents can introduce. Sometimes the child eats them and sometimes they don't. And maybe it sort of depends on the planetary alignment and who knows why those foods are eaten on those days, right? And then the used to foods or the lost foods. And those are the foods that the parents of the pickiest of eaters will tell us, my child used to eat everything and then they turned 15 months old. My child used to eat all of these foods and then look where we are now. So because when I'm looking at what are the foods that we can sort of think about helping that parent and child find again, sometimes in used to foods can be sort of the easier foods to think about. What I'm concerned about when I meet these children is the way we describe, the parents are able to describe the diet. So what I say to the parent is, if you tell me your child likes chicken nuggets, for example, I'm going to write down chicken. But then I'm going to write down the qualifiers. Oh, they must be chicken nuggets from McDonald's, fresh off the grill. They can't be in a dinosaur shape and they can't be cut. Next food might be yogurt. And I'll say, tell me about that. And they'll say, oh, well, it must be Kroger's yogurt, blueberry whipped in the container with the lid opened right in front of the child. And the mom has to feed it to the child. Or the child drinks milk, but only in the blue cup and only if they see the milk going into the cup. They eat spaghetti, but it must be spaghetti length spaghetti. It must be plain without anything else on it. So what is very interesting as we're meeting some of these pickier of eaters is when we ask the questions from the perspective of this parentheses diet, of the parentheses qualifiers, what happens is we begin to get a sense of, oh, how is this working? Where's the worry? Where's the rigidity? Where's the difficulty with change? Because the parentheses gives us information about the level of anxiety, worry, change, stress. So this is what I've written out for you here. This is what that list of foods might look like when we've taken it from the parent. So I will write it in these terms right there on the table in front of the parent as they describe their child's diet. And then I will talk about and focus on those parentheses to better understand where are the edges, where is there possibility of change, how can we help this child and this parent. This list is only really a list until you really investigate it further, because it's going to help us understand what other questions we can ask. And does the child have confidence in their oral skills? And are there certain preferences of sensory that we ought to learn about? Where it can help us understand where is the nutritional starting point, because we team with dietitians all the time. Where is their fear or worry? Because if I say your child likes that yogurt, but what if you gave them a different yogurt? Some parents go, oh, they'd probably eat any yogurt. This is just the one I give them. And other parents will go, no way at all. I've tried other yogurts. The child falls apart, pushes the table over, knocks it off the tray, cries, and is really worried, right? So you need to know those edges. So I ask questions at that stage about to the parent, what would happen if, so when the parent says my child only drinks milk from a blue cup, I'm going to say, well, what would happen if you offer a different cup? What would happen if you tried to change the brand of yogurt? What would happen if dad fed the child instead of mom, right? So I'm going to take every one of those parentheses and I'm going to ask, what would happen if? Because that parent often has a lot of really good information to share about their child's level of worry in the pickiest of eaters. Sometimes the parent finds out that they're the ones that are enabling the picky, because they always buy that same brand. And since they like that brand, they give that brand over and over, and they've never tried other brands, right? So sometimes in the conversation with the parent right here, the parent realizes, oh, well, I could try it other ways. And other times we get a very lot of information about the child's level of worry. So in the pickiest of eaters, often the choices of foods are narrow, the diet is imbalanced. Oftentimes there can be a range of foods that are pretty narrow in color. Often many of us who work with picky eaters would describe their diets often as beige and brown and yellow mac and cheese from a box and Ritz crackers and cereal and maybe a corn dog. So often a brown diet. And if you think about it, if change is really hard, those red foods and those green foods and those bright other foods are pretty different from their secure base. Also, when we're thinking about diet themes, we often find that diet themes often have a lot of processed foods, often, not always. But if you think about it, the processed foods are always going to be kind of the same when you chew them. You know, Kraft macaroni and cheese that many children love is kind of always predictable. It's always going to be Kraft macaroni and cheese. It's not going to have a random pea in it or a random green bean. It's going to be the same. Ritz crackers pretty much feel the same. So if change is hard for you, really hard for you, you're going to like those foods that act the same. And many of these children don't have fruits and don't have vegetables. And think about it, as we speak with adults who can describe their eating challenges in this orbit, they're going to say to us, you know what? A strawberry isn't always a strawberry. Sometimes they're sweet and sometimes they're tart. And tomatoes can be sweet or kind of sour. And broccoli is really different, whether it's cooked really soggy or whether it's raw. Vegetables and fruits are just not as predictable. So if you need same, it's understandable a lot of these diet themes are narrow. Parents tell us they think my child's terrified with foods, it freaks him out, you'd think I was trying to kill him, no way he'd eat this at all, he falls apart. Now, that's a tough way to go to the mealtime if you're a child or a parent. So from the parent perspective, this picky eating, the choices aren't logical. They're not logical to us, but they make sense to the kiddos. They can't change the diet. They can't change the presentation or the brand. They're worried that the diet is poorly balanced because there may not be fruits or vegetables at all. Hard for the family and to eat together. The emotional impact on everybody is huge. Doctors are often not concerned because the kids are often growing. They walk into the office, they get on the scale, their growth is okay, and doctors are saying, yeah, they'll outgrow it. Yeah, they'll be fine. For many kiddos who are toddlers, that's the right answer. They often do outgrow it if we don't pressure them and tip them into worry, right? But for a lot of these picky eaters, they don't outgrow it. That's just not naturally. They don't just automatically know how to try new things. And family and friends often don't get it because there's judgment out there. The universe often tends to judge parents when they're just giving their kids those snacky kind of brown foods, right? But if you think about it as you get to know families, many of these families have 2 or 3 kids, and the other siblings all are fine eaters. It's this child who has a particularly increased level of worry. Eating out is stressful. So from the child's perspective, there can be poor nutrition. It can become really worrisome to even come to the meal. Meal times are highly stressful. Who wants to go to a stressful situation when you were really happy playing on your computer? These kiddos can be really suspicious of change because we grown-ups have tried to sort of sneak stuff in here and there in the past, and kids have caught us at it and maybe have lost a level of trust in their grown-ups. No enjoyment, no motivation to come to the meal. And parents end up getting stuck offering the same food, same brands, same amounts, same feeder, not because they're trying to be lazy, not because they're not willing to try other things, but often parents tell us, I've learned that at least my child eats these foods. And when I try other things and I go to the trouble to buy other things, they won't eat them. And so many parents tell us it feels like it's a waste of money. And so those parents need support. Those parents and these children need support in figuring this out. So instead of our buying into the tendency to blame parents or seeing parents as being guilty of poor habits, I want us to see them as being responsive to their child's needs, responding to their child's extra worry, responding to their child's neurodiversity, whether or not they can label it as that. They are often offering screen time just to help the child focus and stay at the meal. No, that's not my favorite. That's not where we want to be, but you can at least understand how parents got to that point. But also, perhaps the parents need more education, because some of our picky eaters got pickier because we didn't know how to keep the window open, keep the video camera wide, keep the offerings varied. And sometimes as grown-ups, if we didn't know how to do that early on, we do inadvertently help them narrow things down even more. So let's look at a framework of how I believe children learn best in their eating, and how we can avoid some of these issues and keep them from happening. There we go. So in the Get Permission approach, which is the approach that I've developed, that I've worked with for much of my decades-long career, I would like to describe the mealtime in this way as a framework. In the Get Permission approach, in the center is enjoyable mealtimes, and that is absolutely critical to how I think about feeding children. We need enjoyable mealtimes. Around that enjoyable mealtime is nourishment. We are nourishing children with calories, of course, but we must nourish their little souls. We must nourish their little emotional system. And we cannot get food in quotes, get food in at the expense of their emotional well-being. I look at roles, and parents have roles and children have roles. And sometimes parents get confused about what their role is in this process. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. We want children to feel competent, skilled, and confident. We want there to be enjoyment, and we want them to be motivated to do their own eating, not to be eating because the adults are motivated for them to eat. And we want to make sure they have opportunities to be around food they haven't met yet. And can they feel like a celebrated part of the mealtime or food interactions at home? And I will tell you that many of the most picky of eaters that I know don't feel celebrated. They often feel like they're disappointing their grown-ups every day, every meal. And for parents and children, there are lots of meals each day, and therefore lots of opportunities to not feel celebrated. And that personally breaks my heart. So I am going to think of strategies throughout working with children with feeding challenges to bring children and parents together, not in some way bring recommendations that wedge them apart. So the responsive feeding principles that that the Get Permission approach is based on is supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics, that says parents should provide and children should decide what goes in their own mouth. It's supported by the World Health Organization. Suzanne Evans Morris and I wrote the Pre-Feeding Skills book in 1986 and revised it in 2000. And it's based on cue-based, relationship-based, and trust-based feeding principles. And more about the Get Permission approach is on my getpermissioninstitute.com. We have trainings, and we've just launched, so there are more trainings coming up all the time. It's based on principles of responsive parenting that's been popular for some years now. And out of that also has grown a new group of people that has launched responsivefeedingtherapy.com. You'll find a terrific white paper on the values of responsive feeding that I challenge you all to read. And they've just launched an Instagram and a new website called Responsive Feeding Pro within the last couple of weeks. And so I encourage you to go there for other information. And again, this is all in your bibliography resource list. I'm thrilled that even grocery stores now are beginning to put signs in the baby food. This is my Tucson, Arizona grocery store, and it says, feed at your baby's pace, stop when he shuts his mouth, turns away, arches, or has had enough. This is basically saying it's your job to offer the food, and it's their job to decide how much they want and when they want to stop. In the get permission approach, I say, it's the adult job to offer. It's the child's job to determine the pace because they know how they're feeling. They know what their body feels like. They know what they are personally ready for. What I say on a regular basis is that it's not our job to get food in. In the get permission graphics, I use this graphic a lot as a circle of sensitivity. So in the center of it is an enjoyable meal. What happens for some of our pickiest or cautious eaters, depending on their experiences, sometimes they're trauma, sometimes they're worry, sometimes they're genetics, right? Sometimes they're sensory abilities, is that they begin to develop layers and layers of protection around themselves. So they increase their cautiousness. And so when this layer of protection around that enjoyable eating can start when they haven't felt well, because they had maybe a medical challenge, a cleft palate, a respiratory challenge, a heart issue. They couldn't breathe and eat at the same time. They didn't know it could be when the sensory was just wrong for them. It just didn't work for them. When the roles are confused, where their grown-up thought it's my job to get food in you, and the child's going, wait, I want to do it myself, right? And you've heard all kinds of stories about that 6, 7, 8-month-old who refused to eat anything from a spoon when the parent had in mind they were going to use a spoon. And come to find out, once the parent let the child make the choices about what food was going to go in their mouth, the child did so much better, right? So sometimes our presentation and our approach isn't quite working for that child. Yes, I'm a supporter of the concept of offering a lot of different kinds of foods, as in baby-led weaning, but I don't think it's be all end all. I think what I believe in is be responsive. So sometimes we offer children ice cream from a spoon because we're eating it. I don't want parents to be afraid of spoons because they're baby-led weaning supporters. But I love the concept of baby-led weaning and the variety that's offered. Absolutely. We need to give children the responsibility to open their mouth if they want to. Sometimes the child's not ready developmentally. Sometimes the structure of the mealtime doesn't support success. Maybe the child's not hungry at the meal. Maybe they're sitting in a chair that gives them no postural support and they're just dangling with their posture. When the child isn't motivated to eat, they're just plain not hungry. Or when the child is not allowed to be a partner in the process, or when there's too much pressure. So many, many variables can lead to that child building up a pretty big wall of protection. What I talk about in the get permission approach is the importance of starting so in this circle of sensitivity, we're talking about strategies. And the first strategy I talk about is Mealtime Peace. We want to help families start with a more peaceful mealtime. We want to take that level of anxiousness and worry, that level of stress and discomfort, that level of high emotion away from the mealtime and find how can we start the mealtime at a more peaceful place where the child doesn't feel pressured, the parent isn't feeling pressured to get food in, that there's not just anger and crying and tears and gagging and vomiting and stress at the mealtime. And I'm going to also say, as a therapist, we therapists need to make sure our recommendations support that peaceful mealtime. Because I think some of us have done things like tell a family, you must get your child to eat 3 bites of their non-preferred foods before they eat their preferred food. I want to make sure every one of our recommendations is taken into account in that family. Sometimes you can do that with a child and they're not particularly anxious and you can get away with it here and there, right? But in the big picture, it is my experience that that can build pressure and worry and stress at the mealtime. And that maybe there's another way to approach food that doesn't have that level of pressure in it. So we have to know the children we're working with and know the families. So I'm going to share now some strategies about finding mealtime peace and how to help a situation be the best it can. And then at the end, we'll talk about, and when these strategies aren't working and there is mealtime peace, we might need to make referrals because some of these kiddos have a bigger picky eating challenge. You will have in your handout a Mealtime Peace pie handout that is this graphic, and then questions you could ask a family as you're having a conversation in each of these areas that can help you have a conversation to sort of investigate this with each family. What I want to say about each of these sections is these are not rigid rules. Even within these sort of best case scenarios, even within these suggestions of how mealtimes might be better, there will always be exceptions because we are being responsive. Even some of the suggestions I'm going to make here may not work within some particular family or for some particular child. So I want you to make sure that you hear that before I start. So connection matters. The connection the child has with their parents, their caregivers, matters. We know that if we encourage families and children to have meal times together, we want to talk about this mealtime as a connected time, as a time together that includes communication and conversation, socialization, exploration, sensory differences and variations of food, right? In my family, eating was giving and receiving love. I have a grandmother who was a cook when she came to this country, and every food she presented was presented with love. And that's the family that I grew up in relating to food, which is probably why I would describe myself as a food celebrator. Families together, celebrations together, skill mastery, and nourishment. And I put nourishment at the bottom of this list because I want to make sure we think about beyond the calories we're offering at the mealtime, and also nourishing children in participation in meals in some of these kinds of ways. So this was my grandmother, right? So cooking with love, but that nourishment, not calories. We can nourish children with enjoyable food, with pleasant and safe company and connection, with opportunities for autonomy, where the child feels like a celebrated part of that meal. And we're going to be sensitive to the child's and the parent's experience. Feeding is a relationship at the heart. At the heart, it's the parent and child. And I challenge all therapists in the audience to really see the parent and child as a dyad. And we cannot support feeding, absolutely cannot, by only looking at the child, by taking the child down the hallway to our office and bringing them back to the parent in the waiting room later. That's not supporting the dyad. We need to see our job as supporting the relationship, the dyad, and helping the parents be the ones that can be successful with their child and be confident with their child's eating. If the child eats Brussels sprouts for me, it does not count until the child eats Brussels sprouts with the parent, or the parent knows how to introduce a new food in a confident way. So feeding is a relationship that's central to attachment and trust. Gil, you referred to that right in the beginning. Babies learn to love and attach with their parents through feeding, through the touch of feeding, through the look and the eye contact, through the prosody of mama voices and mama sounds and little sounds that we talk to our babies with positive experiences with sucking and swallowing. This baby learns this is a comfortable place. This is from this place. From this place, I can learn connection, attachment, relationship, and I can learn self-regulation. I can learn to grow into a little person who can sit on my parent's lap and move away from my parent and come back to my parent when I need to. Eventually, I can sit over there and just get a little connectedness by just making eye contact with my parent. And pretty soon, I can learn as a little evolving toddler and as the child is growing older, I can learn to take risks from that connected place. Babies feel secure when they have their needs met, when it's predictable, when they have that closeness of touch. And they're ready to learn from that attached and connected place. And they enter that social engagement space that Stephen Porges talks about, the readiness for learn place. Parent feeding practices do not exist independently. They're embedded in a complex system that develops over time. Both parent and child have agency contributing to that feeding relationship. So in other words, feeding problems don't just happen because the parent's a bad parent, don't just happen because the child's being willful or a behavior problem. What evolves is influenced by both what the parent and child bring to the table. So I would challenge, I would suggest the thinking that when parents come to us because their child eats 4 foods, the child contributed to that interaction. The child brought their worry, their sensation, their experience to that worry. And the parent might have evolved to that place in response to what the child brought to the table. So both the child's and parents' experiences come to the table. On the other hand, the child who only eats pouches all day long and doesn't expand past pouches could also come to that place because the parent brought they were in a rush and they didn't understand other ways to offer the child foods, and it was convenient, and they had many other emotional issues to think about, and variation in feeding their baby might not have been at the top of their list. So pouches might have been easy. So then the child is only eating pouches, but that may have been because it's their only experience. So both parents and children come at this, and I'm not blaming either side of this. I want us to try to understand and then start where children and parents are and go from there. When parents described their babies and there were no feeding issues, parents spoke about their feeding relationship with their child in a positive way, about bonding and opportunity. When there were feeding difficulties, parents didn't talk about relationship. They talked about how difficult it was to feed their child and trying to figure out how to feed their child and help that child eat. We have lots of research about the importance of family meals, role modeling at the mealtime, improved self-esteem. Children eat more variety of different foods from family meals. They often do better in school, less at-risk behaviors, right? And I gave you those resources. I think one of the ways that we support connection with families is to help parents find empathy and understanding about what's going on with their child, to educate them, to help them. I talk a lot about being in the child's shoes. And as a feeding therapist, I also talk about being in the parent's shoes, right? To help that parent find empathy, to show up, to help that child understand, or help that parent understand that this is hard and, oh, that's a hard food for you today. There's other foods on the table to choose from, but to help the parent be empathic, validate the child's worry, that they get it. and that they show up. And Siegel and Bryson have a new book, The Power of Showing Up, which I'm just halfway through right now and I'm loving. So I encourage you to think about that one. Clear expectations. The child needs to know what to expect when they come to the meal, right? And so in the get permission approach, I said, we offer as a grown-ups, but we don't demand. If the child thinks that when they come to the meal, the grown-ups are going to demand, force, coerce, make, push, the child to eat during the whole meal, they're going to have that expectation that mealtime's not going to go well. But if they have the expectation that food is going to be provided and they get to choose how much of what's offered that they want to eat, then they're going to have an expectation that it's going to be calmer, more peaceful. Ellen Satter, many of you know, and she's done a lot of writing in the area of pediatric feeding, and she describes the division of responsibility, that it's the parent's role to decide the menu, the where of eating, and the when of eating, because we understand nutrition and we understand that the child's on a tube and we want to help them get off the tube, or they understand what's developmentally appropriate, or hopefully they do. They can describe where are we eating. Like, are we going to eat it walking around all the time? Or is there going to be an expectation that we sit when we eat? And then when? The parent can decide, I'm going to offer this meal and then we're going to have a break so you can be hungry at the next meal. And then we're going to offer again and then there'll be a break. So the parent gets to make those decisions. But the child's role is to eat what they can of what's offered, whether they're going to eat it at all or not, and how much they're going to eat. It is the child's job. If you think of it, when you breastfeed a baby, the baby starts when they start, they stop when they stop, or when they're full. They don't eat the exact same every single feeding. And when all goes well, they grow. They make the decisions. They learn from right away to eat what they can and stop when they're done. In baby-led weaning, babies, when we consider that babies get to decide how much they want to eat, they decide when they're done. And we know as grown-ups, there'll be another meal later and another meal later. And over time, the child builds their skills and their interests and their preferences. So it is not our responsibility to get food in. And that's a very important expectation from the child's perspective. They will know they won't be pressured. They're going to be offered and they'll make those decisions. But if you only offer potato chips and Cheetos at the meal, don't be upset if they're only eating potato chips and Cheetos, right? We want to make sure we offer a variety of foods, but we'll keep talking about this. However, I did not say the parent decides the menu for a really, really picky eater and has decided we're having salmon, roasted Brussels sprouts, which by the way, I love, and salad. That's what we're having. And the picky eater comes to the table and sees nothing at all that looks familiar. I would say in that case, the parent should adapt the menu because there needs to be some food at the table that the most worried eater is okay with. Because if you're really picky and worried, I'm talking seriously picky and worried, and there's nothing that you know at the table, it's very scary. However, even the toddler who's becoming a little picky, what we say to parents is just keep offering, just keep exposing them to new things. They're going to find new things they like over time and with exposure and with opportunity. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So, not our adult job to get food in. Jenny McLaughlin is a speech therapist, and she says the only get that should be involved in feeding is the get permission approach. So thank you, Jenny. I like that. Food choices, when we get to be in charge of the menu, food choices should be around the foods that the family knows, that are in their culture, and that makes sense from a sensory perspective, from a developmental perspective. And one of the things I tell parents is if you only give your child baby foods, they only will know about baby foods, and they'll only know about purees. If you feed your child, however, from children's menus, they learn brown. They learn French fries, chicken nuggets, corn dogs, grilled cheese, right? All those traditional things that are on children's menus. There's a book called French Kids Eat Everything, which I love. And it talks about an American woman who goes to France and sets up a play group and is in awe that the French babies in the play group were eating spinach souffle and grilled artichoke hearts and roasted tomatoes and all these sort of exotic things that none of the American babies in the play group were eating those kind of foods. They were having goldfish, chicken nuggets, little French fry, little French toast sticks, little sort of, those kinds of things. And she was in awe and did a lot of research about what's going on. And what she realized was in France, French people love food. They present food in a beautiful way. Food is very important to them. And the French parents just believed, well, these are the foods that we eat as French people, and our kids are going to love these. And they just kind of believed their kids were going to love those and offered them from early on, from the time they could have beginning kinds of foods. There's good questions coming up here. We need to know the family rules and routines, whether that's about hand washing and prayers and manners. No, it's not okay to go yucky, yucky, yucky. Maybe what we need to tell parents that we need to, we don't get to say yucky. We have to be nice to the chef, but you could say no, thank you. Rules need to be workable for the family. And one of the rules that I support is eat what you want and eat till you're done. Preparation matters. So when we prepare children for the meal, we want to make sure we give them the privilege of being hungry at a meal, that we give them meals and snacks. We help them transition to the meal from whatever else they're doing. If they're playing on the computer and they love it, maybe they read a book just before the mealtime, or maybe they help put napkins on the table, or they do some other activity that's in between the thing they loved and that food meal that might not be pleasant to start with. Kid-size utensils. We invite the child into the meal rather than demand. We prepare for messiness because a lot of families don't want messy, and so we want to maybe put down a splat mat or do what we need to do to help that parent support their messiness factor, messiness tolerance. We want to make sure we talk to parents about their own state before the meal too, because we know nervous systems speak. And if you come to the meal all stressed, everybody's more stressed. Motivation for eating. We want motivation to be intrinsic with eating. That is a goal for eating. You are motivated to eat because you're hungry, you have opportunity, enjoyment, and all of these experiences that I've mentioned earlier. The sensory of the food matters. And so for some of our worried kiddos, we want to make sure that when they're really worried eaters, we want to make sure that we support them in learning to try new foods, but that we're careful with the sensory offerings. We want to make sure that the textures we offer are the right developmental sensory. But some of our children have only one kind of sensory they like, maybe only puree or only crunchy. And we want to be sensitive as feeding therapists about supporting them to get to a new texture in a comfortable way. And I use systematic desensitization and a very slow and careful approach, starting where the child is. But I had a family call me and say, my child hates bananas. He gags with the smell. How am I going to get him to eat bananas? And my comment would be, would you eat a food that you hated the smell of? Would you eat a food you hated the look of or the texture of? We don't. So if your child hates the smell of bananas, I guess what I want to say is that's not a starting point for a food that needs to be on your list for a next food for your child to eat. Offer it again. Eat bananas nearby them. Gradually help them put some bananas in a smoothie so it's camouflaged a little bit. Help the child have experiences with real bananas, helping you cut them up or break them up or hand them to other people. Give the child experiences with bananas over time. And when they start to show an interest, when they start to show a curiosity, that's when they're ready to try it. An internally motivated eater is child-driven and eats what they can of what's offered. the child is saying, I'm hungry, I want to eat that, right? And the parent is saying, eat what you want and eat till you're finished. An externally motivated eater is eating because of reasons outside themselves, because the parent is demanding it, pushing them, pressuring them, bribes, anger, rewards, sticker, shaming, guilting. Even for some of our most worried eaters, praise can even be a little over the top for some of our kiddos. When we're whooping every time they tried something new, the child gets the idea that it's really important to my grown-up that I eat more of that, and it can turn into pressure for some kids. We need to look at every situation. A little guy that I worked with when I was first meeting him said to me, I failed my Lego challenge. And he said, my mom and I, well, essentially, he and his mom went through an entire Lego catalog. This mom would have bought anything in this catalog for her child if he would eat new foods because he had such a narrow diet. She would have bought anything. So they went through together and put a sticky note on each one that he wanted, and then what was the challenge. And so you could see here, for 10 bites of carrots for 10 days. This child, a carrot is nowhere close to the foods this child knows and is comfortable with. It's light years away. He could find carrots and find a way to enjoy them at some point, but his starting point is nowhere near there. And so he said to me, Marsha, I failed the Lego challenge. So I think of if you said to me, Marsha, you need to eat 3 bites of scorpions, black scorpions, before you can have your favorite tiramisu. That's an unfair challenge. It is just not fair. First of all, who the heck decided I needed to eat scorpions? Number one. Number two, I like tiramisu and it's something that's very important to me, but scorpions aren't even close to something I would want to put in my mouth. It is an unfair ask. And if my grown-ups that I trust and love are asking me to do things that feel so unsafe to me, and I live in Arizona, so I know scorpions, refusing them is the right answer there. So it's just unfair. So I want us to make sure that we are asking children to do things that are fair, that they don't lose our trust in us because of inappropriate asks. Externally motivated. These are a bunch of articles that will support why we are looking for internally motivated eating and the challenges with external motivators with eating. It can compromise self-regulation in eating and promote the eating in the absence of hunger. Some of us are dealing with those issues as adults. The negative effects of disliking that required food and craving the reward food. We have study after study that says the more we emphasize you have to eat your vegetables before you get your dessert, the more they want the dessert and the less they want the vegetables. It hampers their ability to listen to their own body. Autonomy matters. Pressure disrupts the child's ability to respond to internal cues. It can exacerbate feeding problems and make mealtime more negative for parents and children. So these are some nice resources for you. Also, the no pressure zone. We have a lot of questions for parents about the no pressure zone. Parents might pressure because they're really worried about their child gaining weight. Maybe they're really worried because they were in the NICU and every single day they went to visit their medically fragile baby, weight gain was celebrated. So you go home and you want the weight gain to be at that same rate and it's not. Or the pediatrician says your child's small. Well, maybe grandma was 4'8". Let's make sure when we're worried about height and weight for kids, let's make sure that our dietitians support families in looking at the big picture of their weight. Because if we really need to worry about it, we do. That doesn't mean we're going to force kids, but we might have to find other ways to supplement their eating while they're learning to enjoy food. So we want parents to know whether they really need to worry or not, and we can help them with information to know that. Sometimes parents misunderstand their roles and they just think, I'm going to get all this food in you and then I'm going to go on and do something else. They got their roles confused, and that doesn't work with kiddos that want autonomy or that are cautious eaters. Some parents are more controlling. That's their style. And maybe they didn't know there might have been another way. Maybe that's how they were fed. So we can give education and support. this book is in your bibliography by Roel and McLaughlin, and they have this great graphic, which I use with their permission, about the pressure cycle. So the child shows a challenging eating behavior. They don't want that. They're throwing it. They're gagging. They're pushing it away. They're crying. The parent gets worried, lacks information and support, has maybe poor advice from maybe one of us or maybe the pediatrician. Then they have a counterproductive practice, which is maybe trying to get more food in them. And then the child feels pressure, and then we feel resistance, and then there's pressure and resistance. And you can see where this cycle continues. When the child is resisting, my mantra is there is probably felt pressure. It's my job then to look this way, to figure out, wow, what can I learn about this? How can I reduce this pressure? You all have great comments coming up. So we don't want to be pushing into pressure, because when we push into pressure, we push kids away from the table and sometimes over the cliff. We're not supporting them emotionally. And then you, more than any group probably that I speak with, really understand trauma and felt safety and the importance of having that child feel safe so they can be in that state of emotional social engagement and not feel pushed over the cliff with unsafe. You know, and Gil, you talked about this in the beginning, about the biology of pressure. Pressure and stress do not work in favor of eating. When a child is kicked into danger because of worry, past experiences, old traumas, big and little, that child has blood flowing to the limbs, not the digestive system that should be taking care of this eating. They end up with more cortisol, stress hormone, which can decrease stomach emptying. Could also increase diarrhea, decreases of oxytocin, which is kind of a happiness hormone. It can lead to appetite suppression, increased anxiety, increased hypervigilance, and anxiety around mealtimes matters. So I just did a 2-hour talk about this night before last, and there's lots more to say about the biology of pressure. But the bottom line is pressure and stress do not work well in eating. And we have lots of studies about, and I've put a number of them in your bibliography, about how pressure just doesn't help. We know that trauma can influence feeding, and when children have abuse and neglect and traumatic experiences, medically traumatic experiences, this can really affect their eating memories. But also, I would suggest that some of the kiddos we work with that are the most picky of eating, that have had feeding therapy, some of our feeding therapies have been pressureful and may have created little traumas. And those little traumas also come up as an emotional memory from an amygdala bottom up memory rather than a cortex down memory. Those amygdala memories, those emotional bottom up memories come back as a reaction, not as a memory. I love the work of van der Kolk. So other great resources I have in your book by Gabor Mate, Pittman, Porges, van der Kolk, Perry, Purges, Schoenkoff, and Siegel. These are great resources in your bibliography if you were interested in more on these issues. Most of them don't talk a lot about trauma with feeding, but talk about trauma in such ways that we can absolutely understand how these trauma memories, these emotional memories, are coming back as a reaction and not a memory. So Dan Siegel talks about a window of tolerance, and this is sort of my version of his window of tolerance concept. But really, we want, in order to learn, we all need to be in that Porges described social engagement state, right? Jean Ayres described this, the just right challenge, where we're regulated and calm and ready to learn. But when children are kicked into an over-aroused state, a danger, fight, flight state, they can become more anxious, more overwhelmed, hypervigilant. And we see children gazing the mealtime to see what's different, and can be immediately fixated and worried about that, or hypervigilant about the look, hypervigilant about the smell, hypervigilant in their gagging response, We see that all the time with our most picky eaters. And these kiddos, when they come to the table and there's worry because there's nothing that they know at that table, this is where they are. This is their starting point. That's not the place where they can learn about new foods. And some of our kiddos go into a more of a dorsal vagal response, a freeze response, a faint response, even a fawning response, where their reaction is underactive, shut down, passive, withdrawn, depressed. And when you're in that state, again, you are not ready to learn. You are not ready to take risks and challenges and learn about new foods that otherwise might have felt scary to you. Children need to feel connected, and they need to have felt safety to be ready to learn. In that connection, children can feel calmer. That connection can help them self-regulate. It is our job as their grown-ups to try to understand, are they feeling safe, and what do we need to do to help them find that felt safe place? We ask parents, what would we need to do at your house to help you find that no pressure zone? And one of the things is to make sure that we're offering some foods the child knows at each meal, that we're having conversations about other things besides have a bite, eat more, eat less, eat differently. That I suggest to parents when we're starting to find this no pressure zone place, let's not even talk about what the child's eating. Now, I don't want that to be such a rigid rule that we never can, because quite frankly, as a food celebrator, I like to talk about food when I'm eating. I like to enjoy it and emote about it. But when we're trying to help that child find that calmer place, that mealtime peace place, we want to make sure that we're inviting them back to a table that is less pressureful. The child has got to know in their heart, I can eat what I can of what's offered, and there will be another meal in my life. And then the last section here, I'm going to go through kind of quickly, is opportunity. Then I'm going to show you a few slides of a quick case study, and then we'll be having questions. So I'll be pretty close to 1:15, a little bit longer. Okay, so children do not learn about new foods when they're only fed the foods they know. When children are picky eaters, or when parents are worried that their kids are just narrowing their diet, if we only give them those narrow foods, they will only eat those. And quite frankly, their diet will become narrower and narrower. So what I say is, children need to be around foods they don't eat yet in order to find foods that they're motivated and interested in trying. And how can we make that happen? We can include them in mealtime jobs. We can include them in helping pass the food at the table when other people are eating. We can offer foods either buffet style, where the child just takes what they want of what's offered, but they're at least around what's offered, or the food could be presented and the child could take what they want of each food. But when really picky eaters are offered food in a plated way, they can be really unhappy about that new food. On the other hand, I'm not saying to you out there, don't ever put a new food on your child's plate. There are plenty of toddlers that only like chicken nuggets and French fries, but you could put some peas on their plate, or some apple slices, or some grated cheese, or a dip that they can use, a new dip they can dip the French fries in. You could still offer those new foods, because that's an opportunity, even if the child is not yet ready to eat that. So I would love it if there could be some new foods near the child, or maybe on their plate. But for my most pickiest of eaters, having it on the plate may not be the starting point. We have children that can help prepare the foods. This child is helping to prepare a salad. She doesn't like salads yet. She's not able to eat any of those foods yet. But this little girl is a celebrated part of this meal, because she got to make the salads for everybody else. We have kiddos making fruit shish kebabs and helping to put the breadsticks in a bowl and help pour the grated cheese in a bowl. And so they're feeling celebrated. They're getting used to new foods. They're having the opportunity to be around foods, even if they're not yet ready They'll never be ready if they don't ever get to see it. They can help pour drinks. This little gal used to color napkins for everybody because she couldn't be around food at first. This was sort of well into some feeding therapy support. At first, she just colored napkins for everybody else. We have research that talks about how kids cooking food helps them learn to try it. So as we meet these picky eaters, I hope that what I gave you was an idea, a sort of an overview about what might make mealtime be more positive, starting with the milder toddler picky eating. And even a lot of these activities are very important and much more seriously important as we get to the most picky eaters. We're going to pay attention to their developmental stage, their connection, health. How do they feel? Because some of the kiddos, somebody mentioned allergies, and some of our kiddos don't feel good enough to eat, and we need to work with teams. And that's part of my job as an occupational therapist and working with children with feeding challenges is to all absolutely look past what's happening into, do they feel well enough for this all to work? Pressure, worry, and genetics matter. So sometimes kiddos, lots of kiddos who you all would describe as picky in some way, will need a referral to somebody who specializes in working with these kinds of kiddos. My philosophy is, if somebody tells you there's a feeding problem, there is a feeding problem. Now, what I mean by that is if a parent says, you know, my child never eats da 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 da, there's a problem, because that parent is asking for some support and try to help their child eat other foods. And I'm always going to try opportunity and sort of lightweight therapy to suggestions first before I go in and try to therapize. I mean, I'm not a therapist by doing lots of tools in a mouth kind of therapist anyway, but before we diagnose big heavy duty feeding issues, I'm going to believe that parent. If they say there's a problem, there is a problem. Now that problem might be, they just need a couple conversations about how to offer food differently and more varieties and keep reintroducing foods they've rejected, right? They may just need that. But it also may be that the child is constipated to their ears and never hungry, or that they have allergies, or that their tongue doesn't work well, or that they're gagging and choking, or that there's sensory challenges. So if they think there's a problem, there is one, and then let's determine if is it a big problem or one that we can support with just a lesser amount of education. So some children, most children, when they're given non-pressured opportunities to eat, most children learn. They learn, they expand their diet, they grow. And some do not. So what I say to you is believe the child. They are communicating with us. We want to be curious about why. And as of tomorrow, the new diagnostic code, pediatric feeding disorders, is out there. And so feeding therapists that specialize in pediatric feeding disorders can support these children. And so I want to show you a really quick case study. Honestly, I'll take 3 minutes. This little guy is 9 years old. He has a diagnosis of autism. He has a very narrow diet. He eats 2 kinds of blended formula each meal, like canned stuff, like Pediasure and other ones, and some crackers and crunchy things. But here's the deal. At night at dinner time with his big family, his mother says, hey, do you want to eat at the meal? Do you want to join the family for dinner? And he says, no, thank you. And she doesn't push him, has never pushed him. She says, okay, you can eat over there on the counter. Here's your stuff. And there is not pressure in his life because he's happy. He feels good about himself. He's able to eat that over there. But they're far apart. And he's not learning to eat new foods. He has high-level autism, but let's just show you what happened. So we said to the parents in our telehealth, what would happen? Well, first of all, we said, you know, in order to find new foods he loves, he's going to need the opportunity to be around new foods. And he doesn't get that opportunity when he's sitting over there. What happens if you invite him into the meal? And she said, well, you know, it seems a little overwhelming to him. So he just says, no, thank you. So we said, what would happen if, remember from the beginning, what would happen if maybe tomorrow, could he sit with his little brother while his little brother is eating breakfast? So it's one person. We're taking the ask and we're grading it down. We're making it so he can be successful. So Mom said, oh, I think he'd love it. And I said, because he would love being a helper. And I said, what would happen if you have him help cooking when you cook in the kitchen? Would he mind? She goes, I think he would love it. You know, I never asked him to help in the kitchen because my daughters help in the kitchen. So we put the idea in for Mom. So the next morning, he watched his mom make pancakes for his little brother, sat with his little brother. We said to Mom, you may not, please don't ask him to try it. Let's just see what he does. He used to like pancakes. Those were on his used to list. So he sat with his little brother, helping his little brother with his pancakes, having a conversation with him. Nobody said he had to try anything. At one point, his little brother asked for more. He went and got him, brought him back for his little brother, felt celebrated. His little brother left the table and he said to his mom, I'd like one. May I have a small one? And he ate it. Mom was so excited that she said, the next day, she said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have him help make a quesadilla for his brother, for his dad. And so she said, I'm going to make a movie for Marsha. And so he went and got his I'm being videoed hat on. And so grilled cheese used to be, I'm sorry, grated cheese used to be one of his foods. So here he is. He's just being asked to make the grilled cheese sandwich.
What do you
and he
think?
noticed that he starts on his
Good?
own. Nobody asked him and he started by putting it in his own mouth. So, okay, but we're not going to celebrate it too much. Let's just see what happens. So the focus with Mom is on making the quesadilla.
How does it look?
Good.
She's
Yeah?
Lots of cheese.
so he's
Melted
getting
cheese. Should we
lots,
cut it? You want to help me cut it?
Yeah.
he's getting lots of experience putting more and more and more cheese in the pile. So he's getting cheese experience, cheese smell. And then look at this. She's teaching him how to cut it, but he's got a mouthful of it on his own and nobody told him to do this. And then here he is at the end, giving it to his dad. And look at how proud he is. And notice he's going to take an actual bite of this quesadilla, which Mom had no idea he might be willing to try until there was zero pressure and there was opportunity. So let's just look at this. Oops, sorry. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Here we go.
See how it tastes.
You're as good as Mom. Whoa. Hey. Hey.
He was not skimpy on the cheese.
So you probably noticed Mom was on the edge of crying. You could hear some tearful kinds of joy. Dad was celebrating him, and he was so proud of himself. Now, this is kind of magical, and the reason it was magical is because they were at Mealtime Peace to start with. He wasn't feeling pressured and argued about, and mealtime wasn't miserable for him. He was being invited into food opportunities, and it worked. No, it's not going to be this magical with every single child you work with, but I love this case study because it shows the power of exposing kids to new foods. And some kids need to see that grated cheese 3 or 4 times, 10 times, but they will never learn to like it unless they've had experience with it. So this is the handout that's 3 or 4 pages long that you'll have in your handouts that are being sent to you. And I would be happy to take questions.
Marsha, thank you so much. This was just an incredibly wonderful presentation. And before we turn it over to Dr. Foley for questions, I just really wanted to remind everybody, please do fill out the evaluation. And particularly if you're asking for CEUs, it's very important that you complete that. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Foley.
Thank you, Evelyn. And Marsha, it was just fabulous. And there's so many questions, which I think it attests to the kind of interest that and what you have evoked in people's minds. Now, I apologize for those whose questions I don't get to because it's a little difficult here to be judicious. So and some of them group themselves. 2 of the first ones that go together. What about situations in which a child does not want to eat the meal, but requests desserts, sweets, or preferred foods which are not nutritious? And similarly, what about the children who refuse any food and rely on Pediasure or a bottle of milk?
Oh my goodness. Those were really, really, really big questions. So what about a child who wants the dessert first, dessert foods and not the main dinner? I mean, there's going to be a continuum of answers for these, because if I'm offering a meal to a child that I'm not sure is going to be their favorite, I'm not offering chocolate cake for dessert. The dessert may be fruit shish kebabs or apples, right? Because I want to make sure that dessert is part of the meal. So in my world, it is part of the meal. What you want to remember, though, is the grown-up is in charge of the offering. So if and is in charge of the menu, so that if you offer a pile of Oreos after they haven't eaten their chicken and you're going to be upset about that, well, then don't offer the Oreos. But you also said, what if kids only eat their preferred food? So of my philosophy, it is that children have preferred food, and some of our kids have gotten stuck with very narrow preferred foods. I want to understand why that is. I believe my experience says that children may only eat the chicken nuggets this meal, but if they're around the salad and they're helping cook past the salad, and they're helping, they're seeing others around them eating the salad, that, over time they're going to eat the salad, because we continue to offer. But what we're not doing is forcing. So what I believe is we reintroduce rejected foods, and children can eat what they want of what's offered. Now, there are some children out there. I knew a child that ate Lay's potato chips and McDonald's French fries for a year. So the starting point for that kiddo, you're gonna look at that in a different way. That child really nutritionally needs some other kinds of things, and the dietitian helped that child like Pediasure. So maybe it's important to that family that child eat with the family, and that child can learn to eat with other people. And if he eats his potato chips and his French fries and his Pediasure at the table with other people, that may be a win and a starting point for that child, because at the table, there's other foods around he may not know yet. If being at the table with other people is too chaotic, and he's going to gag at the smells of the salmon and the Brussels sprouts, then he may need to eat somewhere else and may need to come to the table for short periods to just begin to learn about the table. There are some children that just drink Pediasure. Now, my answer is going to depend on who those children are. So let's say it's an 8-year-old who has a diagnosis of autism and he's only drinking Pediasure. So the first thing I'm going to say to you is, that's what he knows. And at least it's got some balanced nutrition. And it's the starting point. So it's what he gets to eat to balance his nutrition while he's on the way to learning about other foods. And can he have that Pediasure at the table with other people? Can he learn how to be offered food and say, no, thank you? Can he learn how to drink his Pediasure while somebody else is sitting right next to him eating their sandwich? Can he learn how to drink his Pediasure in a cup and in a straw in different ways? So there are plenty of ways to think about that Pediasure to help that child expand their skills in terms of lifelong skills. But it's going to depend on the child's cognitive level, their experiences, how long they've only been doing that. But if he's only been doing it Pediasure for a long time and he's only 8, it's not fair to expect him to come to the table and eat what you're eating. He's just not there yet. We want to start by seeing how we can help that child interact with foods. And we do a lot of that in feeding therapy in a positive way. And we do a lot of that feeding therapy away from the table, so the child can bring those skills when they're confident with them back to the table. I think that's the best I can do on that, because that question just depends on so many other variables. Gil.
So I'm going to pick one here that is quite interesting. What about a child who will only eat his food from the bare floor? The child may start eating food off the tray, but then refuses and dumps onto the floor, which is his preference. Has meltdowns, tantrums, etc.
So when I'm making recommendations, I just don't have any idea about the whole big picture. So I do my best, and this isn't medical advice, right? But I will start feeding children where they're comfortable. So I might even think about putting a towel on the floor and sitting down next to the child and putting a meal right between us and having a picnic and starting where they're comfortable as I try to understand why is it they don't want to be in the high chair. Maybe the child was in the high chair, felt pressured, felt worried, has had bad experience, maybe trauma in the high chair. They dump it, and when they have freedom, autonomy on the floor, maybe they're willing to eat, right? So I'm gonna try to look at myself and look at we grown-ups and look at what that child's experience is. And maybe the child is saying, stop it, I felt too pressured in the high chair. Sometimes I say to families, for a week or so, could we just put the high chair on vacation? If the child screams every time they're put in the high chair, stop putting them in the high chair right now. It's not working right now. I'm not saying I'm opposed to high chairs. I think a high chair is a nice place to collect for the child to collect themselves and focus on a meal. But when the child is screaming in the high chair, if you want to change a child's behavior, change the stimulus. So why practice screaming in the high chair every meal? Why not try to look a little deeper and understand? I wonder why they want to eat on the floor. And I'm betting, but it's only a bet, that the child has a little more autonomy, a little less pressure, and is reacting to past experiences. So maybe give the high chair a vacation, have a picnic on the floor for a few days or on the porch, in front of the TV, outside. You notice I said in front of the TV? It's a place. It's not my favorite place. It's not where children should eat all the time. I don't love it when children are focusing on mealtime on the TV instead of mealtimes. I want them to have the mealtime be meaningful. On the other hand, if one day you just had a tough day and you want to sit down and have everybody eat dinner in front of the TV, is it the worst thing? I don't think so. Because I think the togetherness is really the most important.
Thank you, Marsha. One more question. This one actually is interesting because it's sort of the other end of the spectrum, and maybe this is a little bit from left field. But what about the parent who lets the child eat way too much food, where the child is overweight? The parent says he is so hungry and just lets him eat and eat and eat.
Okay, so to hear me talk is to say, I also don't believe we ought to be restricting children and tell them what they're eating is wrong. I don't think we actually can control what kids eat by saying you can't eat more, you can't have seconds, you can't. What I do believe is that we can be in charge of offering really good, healthy foods. We can give the child some other strategies to slow down. We can, for kids that are overweight, a lot of times there's constipation issues, and we encourage kids to have a drink of water before the meal to help get them started with, or maybe drink even a little bit of their milk before the meal to kind of settle down that worry. I do know children with emotional trauma that have never had enough food and that are hoarders and that can't get enough. And when I've worked with foster children, a lot of foster children, the starting point is to give the child as much as they need until they feel satisfied and trust that there will be enough. But when kids eat too much so fast and then they throw up, that's not going to work. But we can be in charge of how, when we offer the plate so they can take more and then we take it away. And they can finish that. We can help them pace it. And then we can offer, would you like more? And they get to decide. I still am a very strong believer that children, even overweight children, get to decide how much they're eating. And you know what? Overweight is a spectrum. It's a continuum, right? So, and I've worked with kids that are that kind of overweight that have syndromes, Prader-Willi and some syndromes that, genetically things aren't working for them. But I think we can pace those, we can offer pacing, but they can make the choice of how much to put in their stomach. But we might give them, here's a glass of water while we're just talking, having conversation, to let them have time for their food to settle in their stomach, for it to maybe register that they're full. Because, when you eat really fast, when I eat really fast, I want to eat more because I haven't registered yet that I'm full. But when you eat and you have conversation, you have a glass of water or maybe wine, and you sip and you make it an experience, you have time for it to register, I'm full. And you'll find that children begin to reduce that amount themselves. Now, if what you're offering is only high calorie foods, then, we want to make sure that, for example, offer them apple slices, but let them dip it in yogurt or dip it in something else, so that the act of dipping a dipper in something takes some time and focus, and it's entertaining, but it stalls the meal just a little bit. So I'm more apt to use that kind of an approach. Ellen Satter's written some really good information on childhood obesity and whether we should stop children from eating or not. And so I would encourage you to go to the ellensatterinstitute.org, I think, and there's some great resources there.
We'll have one more, Marsha, and this one kind of crosses over to medical, but I think it's on a lot of people's minds. Allergies. What message do allergies send to picky eaters that food can be dangerous?
Oh, absolutely. They can send big messages. I mean, I worked with a mom whose child had FPIES, which is a food protein induced anaerobic syndrome, where kids are really allergic to some of the first foods that they get, like rice cereal and maybe dairy and some of the early foods, where they eat and they vomit and vomit and vomit and vomit and vomit after they've had those foods. So that child understandably is conditioned, makes the association, food is bad. This mom would introduce new foods to this baby in the parking lot of the emergency room. That's how traumatized she was. I understand it. And so that child learned that food wasn't good. So first of all, we have to have empathy. We've got to figure out what's the child's history been and where have they come from. Then we need to move forward with pleasant and positive experiences with foods in different ways. And for him, first of all, it was offering his parents foods. He didn't have a desire to try anything at all because he just thought food was the bad guy. So we needed to help him find ways to interact with foods in tiptoe, systematically desensitized, tiny positive ways so we could build positivity. He had 4 foods he could eat when we met him, and apples, pears, bananas, and maybe 5, and chicken and rice. And so what we said to the parents who were giving pouches in those things, you know what? You could eat pears and apple, all these foods in different ways. So the rice could also be rice crackers. The pears could be freeze-dried pears, or the freeze-dried apples, or freeze-dried bananas, or they could be pears and apples in a drink, or pears and apples in a puree, or they could be frozen, or they could be made in a popsicle. So what we did with him was help him learn to enjoy and celebrate the foods he could eat in a variety of ways, so he got confidence in his oral skills. And then once we helped him learn to like smoothies of apple pear, pear apple, apple banana, we worked really closely with the allergist to say what food, and there's lots of foods out there, what foods are the least likely to have any kind of allergic possibility. And the parents got to do challenges with a little tiny bit of that food in that smoothie to trial it. So before we tried to introduce and play with cucumbers, for example, we knew that they were already going to be okay for him. Now, that's a little bit of a scary thing, because if we gave him the smoothie he liked and all of a sudden he threw up with it and had a problem, you know, we're taking a challenge. And it didn't actually happen that he did have that kind of a reaction, because the allergist that we were working with just was so careful about how far away from allergies we had to start with new foods. But his mother ended up with, you know, in a couple intensives in 30 new foods, and we ended up then teaching him to be confident in his chewing skills. And that's another story. That could be a case study sometime. But so when kids have allergies, or it can be a real challenge. Also, when I meet a child who's a picky eater, who has eczema and skin issues, I am always going to send that child to an allergist, because the skin layer embryonically is the layer of the inside of the digestive tract. So what you see on the outside on the skin is often reflected in the esophagus. So sometimes those kiddos that have a lot of eczema kind of things and are picky eaters because their esophagus is a mess. It's irritated and eroded and painful. So absolutely, you want to work closely with an allergist, because we want eating to be pleasant. If it's not eating, the child's correct, or if the child doesn't feel well, the child's correct response to that food is to push it away and protect themselves. They're not being a behavior problem.
Thank you, Marsha. This was just so informative and exciting and so practical and applied.
Good.
Right on the autonomy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And there's just so much great feedback in the chat box. And I do want to please ask people to fill out the evaluation. We take very seriously your comments, your feedback, and it helps direct further presentations. So thank you so much. And the PowerPoint, the slides, and all of the resources that Marsha shared will be posted as well on the website. So Marsha, thank you so much.
Thank you all for being in the audience and listening to my enthusiasm about eating. And I hope I gave you enough resources that you feel like you could continue your learning on your own and you know places to find more learning. So thanks.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.